How's it going, guys? I want to present my argument from normal experience for why people should be in the business of believing in God. So let's just jump right into it. So to kind of summarize the argument from normal experience, I want to talk a little bit about it first and what my headspace is going into this. Um, what I really want to connect is why are people religious, and then are those reasons good reasons? So, for example, something I would bump into is when I'm having conversations with friends about the existence of God, or when I hear people discuss this topic. A lot of times I hear people resorting to, some kind of first cause argument for the existence of God, or the moral argument for the existence of God, or the ontological argument for the existence of God, and basically talking about arguments and presenting ideas which actually have nothing to do with why they actually believe in God. And so, like, if you think about how many Christians or Catholics do you know who are Catholic because they meditated on the finitude of the universe? Like, I don't know very many. I don't know any, actually. So what I want to try and do is try and connect, hey, why are people actually religious? Like, why are human beings, why should any person be in the business of believing in God? And then, is that reason a good reason? Like, let's philosophize at that level. And that, from my experience, has led to more productive discussions, and that's how I've been framing this whole conversation. And so now I'm trying to put it into a syllogism. So just to kind of say it out loud, I think the reason I actually believe in religion, or I would actually identify as Catholic, it's because the Catholic theology is an operating system for beliefs and values. And I experienced that as a good thing. Like, I had, the reason I'm religious in particular is I had religious experiences in high school. And the Catholic Church gave me a vocabulary and a community to process that with. And not only that, when I wasn't having those religious experiences, I think Catholicism provided me with a moral framework and an existential framework that just really worked out for me. So on the one hand, I was having this great community and I was having these great experiences, and it seemed to check out when I was when I was sober, for lack of a better word. Another thing I want to talk about too is this G.K. Chesterton concept of there's not a single reason why someone's religious, right? So if I try and give a proof for the existence of God, that could represent a singular reason, a singular data point why you should believe in God. But G.K. Chesterton points out that's not why he believes in God. He doesn't believe in God because he heard one argument. It's because he sees everything in his life all pointing in that same direction. And what I'm trying to say is the reason people are actually religious, people like me and G.K. Chesterton, these are also good reasons in theory, and that's what this is all about. Some other notes that I think are worth pointing out. This argument can help describe what a non-materialist universe would be experienced as. So I think something we can get tripped up with is this whole language of materialism, and it's like, well, can you point to a non-material thing? If you're not a materialist, right? Point to a non-material thing. And there's a bunch of dumb bad questions. It's not a good question. But like, how do we form an intuition for what the alternative would be? I think this argument, if you kind of digest the logic, I think this helps with that. This argument doesn't contradict other classical arguments for the existence of God. You don't have to unlearn anything to to learn this argument. I don't contradict Aquinas in any way or anything. I think this argument generalizes to other definitions of person. So if you believe in angels, angels should believe in God too. And an interesting consequence of this logic is, dogs should also believe in a dog god. But you'll see what I mean when we get there. Another thing about this, it recognizes actually polytheistic ideas as interesting approximations, but I kind of situate polytheism as really not following the logic to its final conclusion. So, for example, you can personify war as Ares, as the god of war, but why don't you just take it farther and just personify reality itself? That's kind of the question I would ask, and I think when we go through this, you'll understand why. Some of the limitations of this argument and this whole way of defining things and thinking about things, we actually don't know whether or not God is conscious. We can define him we can define God as a person, and that's all good and useful, but at the end of the day, how far does the logic take us? I actually don't think this argument gets us to a conscious God necessarily. Another thing is, I'm defining people in this argument by a certain way of perceiving the world, and so basically the way I define person is in terms of your experiences. So this whole meme of life begins at perception, that flows out of my definition of person, which I know is kind of limiting. I don't think it's very general, but it's functional for what we're doing here. So that's what I do. So just be aware of that as we go through it. Where are we? So just to present the syllogism up front, the argument from normal experience is premise 1. Personhood corresponds with the symmetric experience of reality. So that is to say, personhood can be characterized by experiencing reality as the same type of structure that the person itself is. Premise 2, if personhood corresponds with the symmetric experience of reality, so if 1, then reality is best regarded as a person by persons. And then 3 follows from 1 and 2 that reality is best regarded as a person by persons. So here's how I'm going to walk through all of this. To kind of defend the first premise, most of the argument is baked into the first premise. So to walk through it, first we got to define what a person is, and then answer the sort of obvious objection to the whole concept. And then second, we can start to think about this concept of person and think about what I call multi-schema experiences, and then answer an objection to that whole concept. And then define schema superstructures and how they fit into this whole conceptualization of what a person is. And then argue that schema superstructures themselves are best construed as persons. And then that eventually leads into this symmetry of I experience reality as the same kind of structure that I myself am. To defend the second premise, how this concept of symmetry leads us to God, it's kind of flows very neatly from the concepts I have to lay out in the first premise. So I kind of answer what the first objection to that would be. And then there's the question of like, what does best regarded mean? Like, what does it mean persons should best regard this reality itself as a person? Or let me say that again. What does it mean that persons should best regard reality itself as a person? Like, what does that technically mean? And then I'll finish off with some concluding thoughts. So first off, I want to define person, and just to do this little schematically, a person is something, some kind of black box, let's say, that takes conscious experiences, data points, any kind of sensory input, or whatever other kind of input you might have to a conscious being. But you take in some experiences, some input, and then you structure those into unique mental models. And so what I mean by unique mental models is mental models whose underlying principles do not derive from one another. And I'm going to define that and lay that out and explain that more in detail. But basically, you take in your experiences of a person and you put them into mental models. So I have a mental model for economics. I have a mental model for how water flows through a hose. I have a mental model for physics, and I have a mental model for relationships and how to conduct them. And I have mental models for all these things. And so that's what I do as a person, is I take in sensory input and I experience the world in terms of these schemas that I've put together for myself. And I would note that these schemas change over time. Obviously, like when you're a baby, you have no schema for object permanence, and it's kind of funny, you could measure that babies don't get weirded out by magic tricks. So I assume these schemas can change over time, and so you could say there's a static element to the person. So at any given sliver of time, at any given frame, let's say, I have the schemas that I would assimilate the inputs into. I would assimilate my conscious experiences into these schemas at any given time, but they can change over time, and whatever changes over time would be the dynamic element. And the reason I'm kind of putting the schemas in this little representation is just my notion of how mental modeling works. It's you have your experiences, but then you have some kind of governing principle for what they are, and how, like what are the underlying patterns to these experiences. And the whole mental modeling process is identifying the principles that govern sets of experiences, as far as I understand it. So this is my little representation of a schema or mental model, is this little bracket here. So what do I mean by unique mental models? So when I drew the picture of the person in his mind, I had two schemas. Why don't I just have one massive org chart with one unifying principle at the top? Why would I have multiple ones? Where does this come from? Like, how am I defining a person this way? Like, where does it seems arbitrary. Like, where's it coming from? And this has kind of been a long time coming. This is just how I think about the conversation at this point in time. This whole theme of different mental models for different things, this whole theme is pretty prevalent in discussions about the existence of God. So, for example, G.K. Chesterton, he has a quote, I think, in Orthodoxy, about, I don't believe in Christianity because of one singular reason. I believe it because there's 1,000 reasons all pointing in the same direction. He talks about ethics, and he talks about politics, and he talks about nature. And in his mind, these all lead to God independently. And so there's this sense of 1,000 mental models going on in his head, which kind of have a similar orientation. You could also see this in Hume's ought-is problem, which may or may not be related to the discussion of God directly, but the idea you have nature, you have physics, and you have is, right, objective truths. And then how do you get morality out of objective truths, right? So you have this notion of different mental models, right? One mental model for nature and one mental model like for subjective, what ought we to do. The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, this idea of weaponized contradictions where the elder demon is trying to explain to his younger demon how you can have contradicting ideas running through people's heads and cause confusion in their life. And this ultimately has spiritual impacts, but the relevant point is, again, different mental models for different things. And in some cases, you could have contradictory ideas running around in your head and not really be aware of it. I would also say, like in The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo is struggling with destroying or protecting the ring, I think these are two competing mental models he has. He has two ideas, two different sets of principles at work in his life and in his experience. And how does he toggle between them, and how does he prioritize them? And so there's just this running theme of different mental models when we're talking about God and spirituality. And so this has kind of been a long time coming, but I'm not just pulling it out of nowhere. And so here are some of my influences. So how do we actually define a person? I would define a person in 3 parts. First off, a person is a conscious being. No surprises there. I think I'm conscious. I think most of us are too. Second part, you're not just a consciousness, you're a consciousness who organizes your conscious experiences into the following type of experience. So you categorize your experiences into a series of schemas or mental models, like I already alluded to before. And also, you have a plurality of mental models with underlying principles that do not mutually derive. So in other words, you have a bunch of mental models running through your head, and the principles which seem to govern those mental models do not derive from one another. So for example, economics and fluid mechanics, let's say, that was the example I gave in the other video. You could say a little more extreme, because I know people are applying fluid equations to economics. So let's just say quantum mechanics and economics, right? The principles of one another don't derive from each other. And so you could say this is the static person, which is the series of mental models you have at any one given time. That's your static person. And then number 3, your dynamic person, is whatever dynamic process forms those schemas for each individual. And I would just observe, maybe this is trivial, maybe it's not. Human beings fit this definition because we are conscious beings. And I think our conscious experiences fit that type. Our life does seem to be characterized by mental models, let's say happiness, relationships, physics, ethics, I forgot a comma there. And the principles of those do not mutually derive. I would argue you could see this within physics, where we have mental models for general relativity and we have mental models for quantum mechanics, and the principles there don't mutually derive. More on the soft end of things, principles for, like, let's say, lasting relationships, they don't always follow the principles of short-term happiness. So we have some mental models for how do relationships work. We have some mental models for short-term happiness, what's going to make me happy right now, today. And those don't always mesh. So you have to prioritize them. Which mental model should I be letting myself get governed by? And I kind of lay this out a little more explicitly in the Tower of Babel argument against materialism, which is another video I did, where I talk a lot more about schemas and how they form and what their implications are. So if you're more interested, you can check that out. And lastly, we do seem to have a dynamic process for how to form those schemas, which is we have some psychology, biology, reasoning powers, spiritual processes, which form the schemas by which we experience reality. So you might object to this definition of a person. So if I'm trying to say, hey, we have two sets of principles, or two mental models whose principles do not mutually derive, well, that means there's a contradiction, right? And so therefore, my definition of person is predicated on just logical incoherence. And the way I would answer that, first off, is there's a difference between contradicting and then cannot mutually derive. So Maxwell's electromagnetic equations, they don't contradict like a Newtonian stress analysis of my truck. Maxwell just doesn't apply to the analysis of my truck, right? Like, just because Maxwell can't derive the relevant equations of motion, it doesn't mean Maxwell is incompatible with Newton, right? They complement, they don't contradict. So just because two sets of principles for different mental models can't derive one another, it doesn't mean they contradict necessarily. They could complement each other. And the second answer I would give, it's possible for someone to interpret a situation with principles that don't map onto reality. So personhood here, the way I define personhood, it's all in terms of how do you experience reality, and that may not map onto reality itself. I could experience something that's totally disconnected from reality, and therefore you could have sets it's totally possible for a person to have contradictory principles running around in their head and not know it. But that just, if they contradict, that means one of them at least doesn't map onto reality, and that's perfectly allowed. It's just, I'm defining person as what you experience to be real, not what necessarily reality actually is. So now that we're kind of developing this vocabulary for what a person is, I want to push it a little bit. So can you experience multiple schemas or multiple mental models at the same time? If the mental models don't mutually derive, what does it mean to experience two at the same time? Is that possible? And so I would just define the term. So by definition, a personal experience is of a reality governed by a plurality of unique principles. And that's what it means to be a person. And so the question is it possible to have an experience of two or more unique schemas or unique principles at once? So let me just state the objection and answer it. I think that's the simplest way to go about this. So objection, it's logically impossible to have a multi-schema experience, because if you were to experience multiple schemas or multiple mental models, let's say, at once, it would create a singular schema or mental model, and you would experience that. And then the person, you would not have a plurality of schemas anymore, and you would no longer fit the definition of a person, which is a contradiction. And so the way I'd answer that is the definition of person does not prohibit singular multiple schema experiences. So even if you were to experience all your schemas at once, all your different mental models at once under one seemingly coherent mental model, or one seemingly coherent fluid experience, if you were to experience, let's say, all of reality all at once, as an intuition or what have you, just the fact that you think you experience that doesn't create a logical impossibility. Like if you have a bunch of mental models in your head and their principles can't derive one another, then the subjective experience, which seems to transcend any given mental model, that's not going to magically create the ability for them to derive one another. It doesn't create that. You're just experiencing, you have this intuition of what it's like to experience or balance multiple mental models at once. It doesn't mean you're magically deriving one from the other. It just means you're having an experience that feels like that. So there's no real contradiction to this this multi-schema experience. It doesn't seem to be a contradictory or impossible concept to me. So if it's possible to experience multiple schemas at once, and I think I'm going to give an example of that, we can also talk about a thing called schema superstructures. So on the one hand, there's a question of can you experience multiple schemas at once? And then on the other hand, how do I prioritize mental models in my given situation? And that's a separate question, and we're going to divert into schema superstructures for now. And then I'll kind of wrap this up in a slide or two, so don't worry if you're a little overwhelmed right now. I'm going to try and summarize it. But so on the one hand, yes, you have multiple schema experiences. On the other hand, here there's this thing called a schema superstructure. So in practice, you have to assimilate your experiences into selected schemas. So if I'm in a situation, how do I know which mental models apply? So for example, if I'm walking down the street and I see a guy kick a dog, right? Immediately the mental models and the principles I'm going to apply to that situation are going to be about ethics and sort of the physics of the dog getting kicked and his biology and, you know, my wincing at what I imagine the dog is experiencing, right? I am not prioritizing my mental models for economics and let's say grammar at that point, right? I'm prioritizing the ethics and the physics and the biology, and I'm not prioritizing other ones. So you might have a multiple schema experience, or like let's say your multiple schema experience at this point is going to be ethics and physics all at once. But there's also a separate process going on which prioritizes those two schemas over all the other ones. So here's the kicker, here's the problem, and this problem is really crucial to the whole thing, which is those schemas like physics and the ethics and the biology, right, and the economics principles and the grammar principles, those principles don't tell you how to prioritize them. Right? There's nothing about economics which says when to apply economics principles. It just states the principles, and then you as a person have to decide how to apply them. So therefore, in practice, we're kind of discovering something here. We discovered that there must exist schema superstructures. So other schemas, these are higher schemas, let's say, which serve to connect underlying unique schemas and prioritize and organize them. So how do I have this organization of mental models which says, hey, when I see the dog get kicked, I'm going to prioritize these mental models and not these? That is a schema superstructure in action. Now, just to kind of help feed an intuition here, don't think of a schema superstructure as a way to derive between principles that can't be mutually derived. Right? Think of it as a way to toggle between schemas and prioritize them. So that's what a schema superstructure is all about. How do I prioritize the mental models that manifest in any given situation or that apply best to this situation I'm experiencing right now? So you can actually kind of graphically represent this. Again, the schema superstructures are not meant to serve as a common reference for derivation between unique schemas, but for balance and prioritization. And I'm trying to represent that by making them look a little different. These schema superstructures organize the schemas under them. They don't derive them. They organize and prioritize them. And yes, just to get technical here, if you were to experience a schema superstructure, and there's nothing in principle against that. I mean, I defined a person as someone who experiences schemas. So if I have a superstructure schema, I might be able to experience it. And I'm just trying to hug the definition of my terms here. So schema superstructures can be experienced, but they don't have to be experienced. And I just want to note, if a person prioritizes some schemas over other schemas they have to interpret any information they might be receiving, right, there is an implicit schema superstructure at play regardless of whether you're aware of it. So you can have superstructures at play in your situation, right? When you see the dog get kicked, you don't think about it, you just react to it, right? So you're not really articulating the principles that prioritize the ethics and the physics of the situation. Like, how do I know to prioritize those things? I don't know, I just do it, right? So I'm not experiencing the schema superstructure in that moment, but I need to recognize logically there is one at play. So to try and balance the superstructure discussion with the multi-schema experiences discussion. So the definition of a multi-schema experience, just to try and summarize, a multi-schema experience is when a person experiences two or more schemas simultaneously whose principles do not mutually derive. Whereas a schema superstructure is the overarching principle or schema or pattern by which a person organizes groups of unique schemas and prioritizes them as needed for situations. Again, unique schemas are ones whose principles do not mutually derive. So a multi-schema experience is always experienced, because by definition, a schema superstructure may or may not be experienced. What's the relationship to the other? So multi-schema experiences result from an implicit superstructure, whether or not the person is aware of that or can articulate that. And then schema superstructures are the organizing principles, again, for the unique schemas underneath them. And I kind of have pictures underneath to kind of help digest this. So now what I want to do is, again, keep pushing the concept, which is, I think schema superstructures are best construed as persons. So both, notice the definitions of the terms again, both schema superstructures and persons are in the business of organizing information into schemas, right? And actually, if the schema superstructure were to have a consciousness of its own, it would identically fit the definition of a person. And I kind of represent this graphically so you can see what I'm saying, where I defined a person as someone who contains unique schemas under it, or let's say organizes experiences into unique schemas and then experiences the world in terms of them. Whereas a schema superstructure is just kind of that organizing principle where you take in some experience and you figure out which schemas apply here and how do I organize those schemas. And so if the superstructure was a conscious being, it would be literally a person. And I just want to pause on this point because this is the critical point of the discussion here. And just to kind of flesh out this point and try and ruggedize this a little bit, personal language is the best way to describe superstructures, period. So again, by definition, none of the unique schemas serve as the organizing principles for themselves. There's nothing about the principles of economics which tell you when to apply economics. And there's nothing about Newton's laws of motion which tell you when to apply Newton's laws of motion. They just are the principles, and you as the person have to selectively apply them. So again, hugging the definitions of the terms, let's try and stay close to the definitions here. Only persons, per our whole discussion, only persons are the organizing principles for unique schemas. Again, from the perspective of persons by our definition, a person is what has unique mental models going on at the same time. And each individual mental model cannot have unique mental models under it, or else it wouldn't be one. It would itself be a person. So therefore, again, a person is the only possible candidate for superstructures. Now, this is weird because I said, well, a superstructure may or may not be conscious. I don't know if it is, but here's the kicker. The superstructure is a person is the only candidate for a superstructure because, again, the unique mental models within a person cannot themselves be the organizing principles. So the only candidate that a person has to experience or talk about or develop or understand the superstructures that are at play in their experience, it is itself a person. I'm kind of jumping a gun. So just let me give you an example. I'm a physicist, let's say, hypothetically. How do I know when to use quantum mechanics versus Newtonian mechanics in order to analyze a crane? Like, that's my problem. I'm trying to understand how my crane works. Do I use quantum mechanics or Newtonian mechanics? And again, I would use this as an example of two mental models, quantum mechanics and Newton's laws of motion. And the principles of those mental models don't mutually derive, I think. So let's just play this out. Like, I'm trying to analyze a crane. What do I do? Which laws of physics do I use? Well, it depends on how big, right? If my crane is atomic or subatomic, use quantum mechanics. Oh, it's not? So I'm going to use classical mechanics. It's a lot bigger than an atom, I hope. Again, so no, this is a guideline. Like, if you read between the lines, what I'm really saying there, when I say it depends on how big it is, read between the lines. What I'm really saying there is, hey, Mr. Physicist, if you use quantum mechanics to analyze a crane, that's perfectly valid. It's perfectly possible because quantum mechanics applies to reality. But quantum mechanics is extremely inconvenient for your situation, so use Newton instead. And that's what I really mean when I say it depends on how big. Because I could seem like I'm defining objective terms on when to use one set of principles or another. But really, it comes down to the subjective experience of the physicist and what is it going to be like for him to apply those mental models. So, most importantly, this question of whether to analyze the crane with quantum mechanics or Newton is not informed by the principles of quantum mechanics or Newtonian mechanics themselves, right? The question of whether to apply my quantum mental model or my Newton mental model is not informed by the models themselves, but it's informed by the implications to me as the person who is running these mental models. So I think that's the basic intuition here. So then here's the thing, which is, where does God come into this whole conversation? So we have this notion of superstructures and multi-schema experiences and persons, and it's, where does God come into it? So I just want to remind everyone, the organizing superstructure for all of your schemas. So we can have superstructures which organize my crane, right? Do I use quantum mechanics or Newton's laws of motion? And I can have a superstructure for that. But what about the superstructure for all of my schemas all at once? Like, what about all of my mental models of the world all at once? Well, that would be the superstructure or set of superstructures, I don't know, governing reality itself as I experience it. So again, this is the argument from experience. How do I experience reality? Well, it seems like there's a superstructure at play that organizes all of my schemas all at once. And again, schema superstructures are best intuited as persons by persons. Again, because a person is the only possible candidate for a superstructure. If we're hugging the definition of what persons are and developing this whole framework off of that. So therefore, there appears to be, again, if I'm a person experiencing reality as a bunch of mental models that don't derive from one another, there appears to be a person orchestrating the principles which govern reality itself, which is not my experiential consciousness. And that's the heart of the argument. Now, the first objection you might have to this, I'm kind of zipping along here, if you can pause the video if you need to, but the first objection you might have to this is, no, it's not God, it's you. So what I mean by that is, well, objection. The sum total of all your experiential schemas and superstructures, well, that's you, right? That's not God. That's literally the definition of me, isn't it? Isn't all my schemas and all my superstructures, isn't that me? The answer is no. The definition of a person is a conscious being who experiences in terms of those schemas. The person is not the schemas themselves. The person is not the superstructure itself. The person is the conscious being who experiences reality in those terms, if that makes sense. So there's a schema for theme parks, and I'm not the theme park. I'm the person who experiences this concept of theme park. So, therefore, superstructure experiences would be that of a seemingly other person who appears to orchestrate the principles of the mental models under its cognizance. So, I would cite evidence for this, kind of weak evidence maybe, I don't know, we could debate this. Evidence for this is people who experience a transcendent God do not think that they themselves are God. Like, I don't know any Christian who thinks I'm God, right? As a footnote, this is kind of in the weeds, but I have heard some people say, well, being is God, like God is reality itself, but the way it comes out when they say it is, well, God is me, and God is my dog, and God is everything, right? And that's their way of saying God is being itself. But what I would argue, and I would try and clarify, is I would say that, first of all, they are experiencing some combination of a personal other, and they're also experiencing a sort of mirror schema, right, where their consciousness contemplates itself. And neither of those two things contradict the idea that multi-schema experiences or superstructures are innately me, right? I think I would still think even people who say the phrase God is me and God is everything, I would still think that they're really experiencing God as an other, and that's how I would make the argument. But moving right along. So we're kind of getting near the end here. The key terms of the key premises are best regarded and symmetry. So what do I mean by best regarded, and what do I mean by symmetrical, now that we've kind of laid out the whole framework here? So again, I would say the multiple schema experience, or the schema superstructure in question, is best regarded as personal because, again, no schema, none of the unique schemas under it can be used to conceptualize it. So what I would say is, again, reality as a whole appears to be governed by the principles of all the unique mental models. So if, hypothetically, if you as a person were able to experience reality as a whole, if you were able to experience all of your mental models all at once, this would be a multi-schema experience, again, by definition, but it would also be a personal experience because whatever unified experience you're having is of multiple schemas whose principles don't mutually derive, and therefore it's a personal one by definition. And so that's what I mean ultimately by the symmetrical experience of reality. And that's really the argument. And as a note, you're not required to have a multi-schema experience. You're not required to experience superstructures. There's a lot of people who feel like they don't experience God, and that's fine. You don't have to. This is the argument from normal experience. This is not the argument from religious experience. But what I'm saying is, if you did have a multi-schema experience, it's best regarded and best conceptualized as personal, because again, there's no other schematic candidate for that aside from a person. So that's basically the argument. I guess what I want to finish with is just kind of reiterating the original notes and the original highlights, and seeing if we could look at it with a fresh set of eyes now that we have all the vocabulary under our belts. So why are persons religious, and are those reasons good reasons? Again, theology is an operating system for beliefs and values. And the way I would phrase that now is, well, it's an operating system. It's the superstructure for schemas whose principles don't mutually derive. We can kind of start to think about, how does a non-materialist universe get experienced? It's like, well, we give a bunch of examples of that where it's like even within physics, you have this problem of principles not deriving one another. And so you have to start resorting to the language of the physicist to talk about these things and how to balance different sets of principles rather than the physics itself. And that's just an innately personal universe at the end of the day, which you're experiencing as a total thing. Again, this doesn't contradict other classical arguments for God's existence. You could have an unmoved mover as the ground source of reality. My question is, how do we experience that reality, and what do those experiences imply? you can generalize to other potential persons, right? So angels should believe in God too for the same reasons. Like, if an angel has multiple mental models that don't mutually derive, this argument applies to them. Same thing with dogs. If dogs have multiple mental models whose principles do not derive one another, they would conceptualize reality as, governed by some dog in the sky, I guess. Kind of a weird way of putting it, but you can potentially classify dogs as persons in the same. Again, it's a very general way of defining things. You could, again, recognizing polytheistic ideas as approximations. So war itself, like war, or the god Ares, right? This is a whole bunch of mental models wrapped up into one. It's war has to do with killing other people, but war also has to do with, pillaging and what do I do with survivors and what are the rules of engagement. It's all these mental models, which can be wrapped up into a superstructure called Ares, which you can experience as a person if you so happen to have that intuition. What I would say is, if we're being philosophical about this, the real person that we're curious about is reality itself. It's the superstructure for all of the schemas, not just some of them. And I would add, this is not one I had at the beginning of the slideshow, but I would say reality itself, is kind of a final note, is a static part of the person. And that's how we would, if we were right now to experience all of my mental models all at once, and I would have this intuition of reality all at once, that would be a static person, because I'm experiencing the world in terms of the static schemas I have in place right now, and therefore my experience of reality itself is of a static person and not the dynamic part. Now, my experience of reality, my experience of God, let's just say, is subject to change over time, and that's fine. It depends on all the mental models I have running at once. So again, this is very flexible, and this also captures the psychology of religion. Like, my perception of God has changed, and this argument actually provides a language to talk about those things in terms of schemas and superstructures and static and dynamic elements of a person. So again, some of the limitations of this argument is, this is reality as I experience it, and who knows if it's reality. And I would argue that the way we form schemas is not arbitrary. I would argue that the way we form mental models of the world actually does map onto the world to a reasonable enough extent. There is a question of whether God is conscious. So let's say we do have accurate mental models of the world. Would our intuition of God necessarily, or would our experience of God necessarily implicate God's consciousness? And I would say I don't know. It certainly seems that way. We don't have any other candidate aside from persons to aggregate all of these mental models, but it's not like we have a choice. But this argument doesn't get us all the way there, so that's a limitation. Again, life begins at perception, because we're defining people by how they organize schemas and like what's your perception of reality. And so if you're not a conscious being, then you're not a person by this definition. So life begins at perception, and I anticipate that a bunch of pro-life people are going to be dissatisfied with this. But I think this definition of a person did get us this argument, and whether you want to borrow that or not, it's up to you. But and lastly, the limiting factor is yours truly. Like, philosophy is not my wheelhouse. This is just me, shooting my theories into the internet. So I'm sure there's going to be things that I missed. I'm sure there's things that I'm going to clean up, and I'm sure I'm going to look at this in a year, and after having conversations about it, and kind of kicking myself a little bit for being so silly about how I presented this. But I'm just going to put it out there, and if you guys like it, run with it. If you have questions, let's talk about it, and let's just put it through the ringer and see where it gets us. So that's all I got. Thanks for tuning in.